The seven-country travel ban imposed by President Trump continues to make waves across the world, and its impact quickly became evident at many airports, including DIA. Over the weekend, international arrivals were met with support from demonstrators and attorneys offering assistance, with many travelers in legal limbo. David, speaking of legal issues, I know there's a court battle over at least a portion of it. Take us through legally of where we're at with this travel ban and what we're seeing.
For the broadest attacks on it, for example, the lawsuit filed by the state of Washington, and then some others have come along as well, I think that the chances of success are very slender. The 7 countries on this list are the 7 that were designated by an act of Congress in 2015, naming Iraq and Syria, and then 5 more countries added by President Obama using his authority under that law enacted by Congress to add the other 5. And it said, if you've ever visited one of these 7 countries, which are known as terrorist training centers, your visa application is problematic. You know, you can maybe come up with some excuse or some reason like, oh, the reason I was in Tehran was because I was there for a business conference, and here's the data on the, here's the documentation on that. That was already the law. So when the current administration steps that up and says, we're going to suspend new entries for 90 days while we look at this and maybe come up with something even more vetting than the extra vetting the Obama administration already had, I think it's going to be pretty tough to say that's unconstitutional, especially in light of the great deference that courts give to Congress and the president on the field of immigration in particular. Now, how this was rolled out and implemented was a catastrophic fiasco. Of all the big things that the new president's done with his executive orders and things like that, almost all of them really didn't have an immediate effect. You could say, I hereby order that we start working on building the wall. Well, fine, but that doesn't mean the wall is going to go up the next day. But this is something that immediately impacted people's lives. It was done with complete incompetence and chaos. And it says something very dangerous about the administration, even beyond this issue, because new White Houses sometimes need to get on their feet and have some trouble in their early days. But when you're rolling out a policy, that's where you got everything under your control. And they couldn't do it properly, even with that. And that's a real warning sign about how they will deal with something that's not in their control when a crisis comes at them.
Penn, this was called a variety of things. One I saw things called I think a chaos event. Almost meant as either a distraction or something, so that you're watching the right hand because you don't know what the left hand is doing. And then on one end, folks were saying, hey, this is an out-and-out Muslim ban that he wanted to have. And when those were trying to get debunked, Rudy Giuliani, bless his heart, comes out and says, yeah, that's what he asked me to do, so I gave him this information. So with the stuff you're seeing, how do you characterize what we've witnessed?
What we witnessed, and I think the way this is going to play out in court is going to be interesting, because you have laws that are or actions that are unconstitutional or improper on their face, but then you have laws that are unconstitutional or improper as applied. And I think David touched on it. The key issue here is this was probably the most incompetent, mean-spirited, disruptive way of trying to establish policy by fiat of a king or emperor as opposed to the rule of law. Most of what's in this executive order isn't necessarily grounded in what Congress passed in law. True, countries were placed on a list. True, immigrants from those countries were monitored and vetted. But Congress never authorized an instant ban for the next 120 days or 6 months, saying people can't come back into the country, even people with green cards who have been vetted through the immigration process before and supposedly are now approved to move back and forth from this country. It was incompetently rolled out because even the Pentagon approached the White House and said, we need some exceptions because you have now restricted the movement of people we count on to handle and conduct military affairs and other diplomatic missions. And the stated justification is odd. Clearly, this is a president who was more concerned about fulfilling a campaign promise than doing something real. Because when you invoke what happened on September 11th, and one of the countries you don't include in your order is Saudi Arabia, where most of the terrorists came from on that day, it just doesn't make any sense. So I don't know if the court challenges are as important as the fact that this administration has already started to and will have to continue to roll this thing back because they clearly didn't have all their people on board when they started. And it's just a ham-handed attempt that has, quite frankly, just made the U.S. look bad.
Gregor, you have seen a lot of stories as a former editor of the Denver Post that you've had to figure out the headlines and how, what angle is the most important for people to see here, to know it's the very front part of the story. When you see this, where does your gut tell you that's the most important thing to see?
Well, obviously the policy implications are the most important, but the most interesting, I think, is the reaction to it. When I turned on the television, I thought I was looking at a report from Turkey. I mean, I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. Almost the spontaneity of it reminded me of Arab Spring. I mean, it was really interesting. And when you looked at the signs and stuff, I think one of the critical things is the word resistance. You don't really see that word too often associated with American politics, but I think that there was something very special about this, and I found it to be quite interesting. And I also thought it was interesting that that it went on for more than one day. It went on for several days, and I think we're going to see that replicated more and more, depending on how aggressive the president is in delivering on his campaign promises. But I thought that was interesting, and that would be something that, if I were sitting in my old chair, that I would be paying a lot of attention to.
Patty, as you look at this, is it more of a chaos event? There's something else to be looked at here? Or is this the event and this is where the focus should be?
Well, the fact that it was so incompetently rolled out is one of the really frightening things because what'll happen next? He did threaten this. It did happen. I also have to point out there's the term Monday Night Massacre in politics. We've got the Friday afternoon fiasco, which is this came down right after we'd filmed last week's show. Mm-hmm. And it came down so fast. We didn't have any warning, obviously, but neither did the Pentagon, neither did the State Department. Incredible the way it happened. And I'm with Greg, the fact that there was so much spontaneous protests. In Denver, 2 days at DIA, we had our reporter out there. And what was really interesting is originally the cops weren't prepared for it. They gave some bad advice about free speech, but then everyone moved outside on the plaza. The protests continued for hours. The cops got better. Chief White was there, and Denver was peaceful as opposed to, say, Seattle. So we are definitely learning some lessons here in Denver. Wish Washington could learn to damp down on the chaos, too.